God makes men sensible of their misery before he reveals his love and mercy, taken from Hosea 5, verse 15. I will go and return to my place, till they have acknowledged their offense, and seek my face. In their affliction they will seek me early. In the preceding part of the chapter threaten the destruction of Ephraim. Ephraim in the prophets generally means the 10 tribes or the kingdom of Israel, as distinguished from the kingdom of Judah. When we read of Ephraim and Judah in the prophets, thereby is meant the whole people of Israel of the 12 tribes as in verse 12 of this chapter. Therefore will I be unto Ephraim as a moth, and to the house of Judah as rottenness. By Judah is meant the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, which were under the king of Judah, and by Ephraim is meant the 10 tribes under the king of Israel. Ephraim is put for the whole kingdom of Israel because Samaria, the seat of the kingdom, the royal city, was in that tribe. In the verse immediately preceding the text, it is declared in what a terrible manner God was about to deal with Ephraim. Hosea 5, verse 14. For I will be unto Ephraim as a lion, and as a young lion to the house of Judah. Even I will tear and go away, and none shall rescue him. In the text, God declares how he would deal with him after he had torn as a lion. First, God declares how he would withdraw from them, Hosea 5, verse 15. I will go and return to my place, when I have torn as a lion. I will go away. I will leave them in that condition. I will depart from them, and they shall see no more of me. Number 2, what God will wait for in them before he returns to them, to show them mercy. There are 3 things here signified. First, that they should be sensible of their guilt, Hosea 5, verse 15, till they acknowledge their offense. It is in the original, till they become guilty. That is, till they become guilty in their own eyes, till they are sensible of their guilt, in the same sense as the same expression is used in Romans 3, verse 19, that every mouth may be stopped. All the world may become guilty before God, that is, become guilty in their own eyes. Secondly, that they would be sensible of their misery. Implied in the expression in Hosea 5, verse 15, in their affliction they shall seek me. Their calamity was brought upon them before God had torn them and left them. But in their pride and perverseness, they were not well sensible of their own miserable condition, as this prophet observes in chapter 7, verse 9. Number 3, that they should be sensible of their need of God's help, which is implied in their seeking God's face, and seeking him early, that is, with great care and earnestness, before they would not seek God. They were not sensible of their helplessness, as we learn in the verse, but one preceding the text, Hosea 5, verse 13, when Ephraim saw his sickness, and Judah his wound. Then went Ephraim to the Assyrian and sent to King Jacob. But as we are there told, he could not heal him nor cure his wound. Notwithstanding all the help he could put forth, God wounded him, tore him as a young lion, and as he declares would leave him, and he should cease going to any other, and should be sensible that no other could heal, and accordingly come to him for healing. Doctrine, that it is God's manner to make men sensible of their misery and unworthiness before he appears in his mercy and love to them. That it is ordinarily thus with respect to the bestowment of great and signal mercies, and secondly, that it is particularly so with respect to revealing his love and mercy to their souls. Number 1, this is God's ordinary way before great and signal expressions of his mercy and favor. He very commonly so orders it in his providence, and so influences men by his Spirit, that they are brought to see their miserable condition as they are in themselves, and to despair of help from themselves, or from an arm of flesh, before he appears for them, and also makes them sensible of their sin, and their unworthiness of God's help. Disappears from the account which the Scriptures give us of God's dealing with his people. Joseph, before his great advancement in Egypt, must lie in the dungeon to humble him and prepare him for such honor and prosperity. The children of Jacob, before Joseph reveals himself to them, and they receive that joy and honor and prosperity which were consequent thereupon, pass through a train of difficulties and anxieties, till at last they are reduced to distress, and are brought to reflect upon their guilt, and to say that they were verily guilty concerning their brother. God humbled them in his providence, and then an end was put to all their difficulties, and their sorrow was turned into joy upon Joseph's revealing himself to them. Jacob, before he hears the joyful news of Joseph's being yet alive, must be brought into great distress at the parting with Benjamin, and supposed loss of Simeon. He was reduced to great straits in his mind. He says in Genesis 42, verse 36, "All the things are against me." But soon after this, he has these gladsome tidings brought to him. Genesis 45, verse 26, "Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt." And to confirm it, he sees the wagons and the noble presents which Joseph sent to him, so that he was now brought to say, in Genesis 45, verse 28, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die." And so with the children of Israel in Egypt, their bondage must wax more and more extreme. But yet Pharaoh gives commandment that the more should be laid upon them, and the taskmasters tell them that they must get their straw where they can find it, and nothing of their work should be diminished. And quickly upon this was their deliverance. So when the children of Israel were brought to the Red Sea, the Egyptians pursued them, and were just at their heels, and they were reduced to the utmost distress. They see that they must assuredly perish unless God works a miracle for them, for they were shut up on all sides. The Red Sea was before them, and the army of the Egyptians encompassing them round behind. And they cried unto the Lord, and then God wonderfully appeared for their help, and made them pass through the Red Sea, and put songs of deliverance into their mouths. So before God brought the children of Israel into Canaan, he led them about in a great and terrible wilderness through a train of difficulties and temptations for 40 years, that he might teach them in their dependence on him and the sinfulness of their own hearts. Deuteronomy 32, verse 10. He found him in a desert land, and in the waste, howling wilderness he led him about. He instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. God brought them into those trials and difficulties in the wilderness to humble them, and let them see what was in their hearts, that they might be convinced of their own perverseness by the many discoveries of it under those temptations, and so that they might be sensible that it was not for their righteousness that God made them his people, and gave them Canaan, seeing it was so evident that they were a stiff-necked people. Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3. "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee, and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and allowed you to suffer hunger, and fed you with manna, which you knew not, neither did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord does man live." In verses 15, 16, and 17, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought you forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers knew not, that he might humble you, that he might prove you to do you good at the latter end. And you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. And so we have examples of this from time to time in the history of the judges. When Israel revolted, God gave them into the hands of their enemies. He let them continue in their hands. He let them continue in their hands till they were reduced to great distress, and saw that they were in a helpless condition, and were brought to reflect on themselves and to cry unto the Lord. And then God raised them up a deliverer. And when they cried to God, he would not deliver them till he had humbled them and brought them to their own unworthiness and owned that they were in God's hands. Judges 10, beginning with the 10th verse. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, saying, we have sinned against you, both because we have forsaken our God and also served Baal. And the Lord said unto the children of Israel, did not I deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites, from the children of Ammon, and from the Philistines, the Zidonians also, and the Amalekites and the Mammonites did oppress you, and you cried to me, and I delivered you out of their hand. Yet you have forsaken me, and served other gods. Therefore I will deliver you no more. Go and cry to the gods which you have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your tribulation. And the children of Israel said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do you unto us whatever seems good to you. Deliver us only, we pray you, this day. And they put away the strange gods from among them, and served the Lord, and his soul was grieved for the misery of Israel. And this is the method in which God declared from the beginning he would proceed with his people. Leviticus 26, verse 40, and so on. If they shall confess their iniquity, and the iniquity of their fathers, with their trespass which they trespassed against me, and that also they have walked contrary to me, and that I also have walked contrary to them, and have brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised hearts be humbled, and they then accepted the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I'll remember the land. The land also shall be left to them, and shall enjoy her Sabbath, while she lies desolate without them. And they shall accept the punishment of their iniquity, even because they despise my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes. And yet for all that, when they be in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, neither will I abhor them to destroy them utterly, and to break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. But I will for their sakes remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the heathen, that I might be their God. It is God's manner, when he will bestow signal blessings in answer to prayer, to make men seek them and pray for them with a sense of their sin and misery. As 1 Kings 8, verses 38 and 39. What prayer and supplication soever be made by any man, or by all your people Israel, which shall know every man the plague of his own heart, and spread forth his hands toward his house, then hear, you in heaven, your dwelling place, and forgive, and do, and give to every man according to his ways, whose heart you know. For you, even you alone, know the hearts of all the children of men. By knowing the plague of their own hearts is meant both their sin and their misery. Being sensible of their misery is included, as is evident from the manner of expressing the same petition of Solomon's prayer, as it is related in 2 Chronicles 6, verse 29. Then what prayer or supplication soever shall be made of any man, or of all your people Israel, when every man shall know his own sore and his own grief, by which is probably meant his misery and his sin, which is the foundation of it. Paul gives us an account how God brought him to have despair in himself before a great deliverance, which he experienced in 2 Corinthians 1, verses 9 and 10. But we had the sentence of death on ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God, which raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a death. How did Christ humble the woman of Canaan, or bring her to the exercise and expression of a sense of her own unworthiness before he answered her and healed her daughter, when she continued to cry, after he answered her not a word, and seemed to take no notice of her, and his disciples desired him to send her away, and when she continued crying after him, he gave a very humbling answer, saying, It is not fit to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs. And when she took it well, his owning that being called a dog was not too bad, and he owning that she was therefore unworthy of children's bread, she only sought the crumbs when Christ answered her request. And the experience of God's people in all ages corresponds with those examples. It is God's usual method before remarkable discoveries of his mercy and love to them, especially by spiritual mercies in a special manner to humble them and make them sensible of their misery and helplessness in themselves, and of their vileness and unworthiness, either by some remarkably humbling dispensation of his providence or influence of his Spirit. We come now, secondly, to show particularly that it is God's manner to make men sensible of their misery and unworthiness before he reveals his saving love and mercy to their souls. The mercy of God, which he shows to a sinner when he brings him home to the Lord Jesus Christ, is the greatest and most wonderful exhibition of mercy and love of which men are ever the subjects. There are other things in which God greatly expresses his mercy and goodness to men, many temporal favors, the mercies already mentioned which God bestowed upon his people of old, his advancing Joseph in Egypt, his deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt, his leading them through the Red Sea on dry land, his bringing them into Canaan and driving out the heathen from before them, his delivering them from time to time from the hands of their enemies, were great mercies. But they were not equal to this of his people from under the guilt and dominion of sin. Several of them were typical of this, and as God would thus prepare men for the bestowment of those less mercies by making them sensible of their guilt and misery, so especially will he so do before he makes known to them this great love of his in Jesus Christ. When God designs to show mercy to sinners, it is his manner thus to begin with them. He first brings them to reflect upon themselves, and consider and be sensible what they are, and what condition they are in. What has already been said proves this. There is a harmony between God's dispensations, and as we see that this is God's manner of dealing with men when he gives them other great and remarkable mercies and manifestations of his favor, it is a confirmation that it is his method of proceeding with the souls of men when about to reveal his mercy and love to them in Jesus Christ. First, God makes men consider and be sensible of what sin they are guilty of. Before, it may be, they were very regardless of this. They went on sinning and never reflected upon what they did, never considered or regarded what or how many sins they committed. They saw no cause why they should trouble their minds about it. But when God convinces them, he brings them to reflect upon themselves. He sets their sins in order before their eyes. He brings their old sins to their minds so that they are fresh in the memory of things they had almost forgotten, and many things which they used to regard as light offenses, which were not wont to be a burden to their consciences, nor to appear worthy to be taken notice of. They are now made to reflect upon. Thus they discover of what a multitude of transgressions they have been guilty, which they have heaped up till they are grown up to heaven. There are some sins especially of which they have been guilty, which are ever before them, so that they cannot get them out of their minds. Sometimes when men are under conviction, their sins follow them and haunt them like a specter. God makes them sensible of the sin of their hearts, how corrupt and depraved their hearts are. And there are two ways in which he does this. One is by setting before them the sins of their lives. They are set in order before them. They appear so many and so aggravated that they are convinced what a fountain of corruption there is in their hearts. Their sinful nature appears by their sinful lives. There is sin enough, which every man has committed, to convince him that he is sold under sin, that his heart is full of nothing but corruption, if God by his Spirit leads him rightly to consider it. Another way, which God sometimes makes use of, is to leave men to such internal workings of corruption under the temptations which they have in their terrors and fears of hell. It shows them what a corrupt and wicked heart they have. God sometimes brings us good out of this evil to make men see the corruption of their nature by the workings of it under temptations, which they have in their terrors about damnation. God leads them through the wilderness to prove them, and let them know what is in their hearts, as he did the children of Israel, as we have already observed. By means of the trials which the children of Israel had in the wilderness, they might be made sensible what a murmuring, perverse, rebellious, unfaithful, and idolatrous people they were. So God sometimes makes sinners sensible what wicked hearts they have, by their experience of the exercises of corruption while they are under convictions. Not that this will in the least excuse men for allowing such workings of corruption in their hearts, because God sometimes leaves men to be wicked, that he may afterwards turn it to their good, when he in infinite wisdom sees fit so to do. We must not go and be wicked on purpose that we may set good by it. It will be very absurd as well as horridly presumptuous for us so to do. Though God sometimes in his sovereign mercy makes those workings of corruption and a spirit of opposition and enmity against God a means of showing them the vileness of their own hearts, and so to turn to their good. So God oftentimes is provoked by this utterly to withdraw and forsake them, after the example of those murmurers whose carcasses fell in the wilderness, of whom God swore in his wrath that they should never enter into his rest. And they who allow themselves therein are the most likely so to provoke God. But it is God's manner to show men the plague of their own hearts by some means or other, before he reveals his redeeming love to their souls. While sinners are unconvinced, sin lies hidden. They take no notice of it, but God makes the law effectual to bring men's own sins of heart and life to be reflected on and observed. Romans 7 verse 9. I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived. Then sin appeared and came to light, which was not before observed. Joseph revealed himself to his brethren is probably typical of Christ's revealing himself to the soul of a sinner, making known himself in his love, and in his near relation of a brother, and a redeemer of their souls. But before Joseph revealed himself to them, they were made to reflect upon themselves and say, Genesis 42 verse 21, we are verily guilty. Number 2, God convinces sinners of the dreadful danger they are in by reason of their sin. Having their sin set before them, God makes them sensible of the relation which their sin has to misery. And here are two things of which they are convinced about. Their danger. God makes them sensible that his displeasure is very dreadful. Before they heard often about the anger of God and the fierceness of his wrath, but they were not moved by it. But now they are made sensible that it is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. They are made in some measure sensible of the dreadfulness of hell. They are led with fixedness and impression to think what a dismal thing it will be to have God an enraged enemy, setting to work the misery of a soul, and how dismal it will be to dwell in such torment forever without hope. Isaiah 33 verse 14. The sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness is surprise to hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with a devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? Other sinners are told of hell, but convinced sinners often have hell, as it were, in their view. They, being impressed with a sense of the dreadfulness of its misery, is the cause why it works upon their imagination oftentimes, and it will seem as though they saw the dismal flames of hell, as though they saw God in implacable wrath exerting his fury upon them, as though they heard the cries and shrieks of the damned. Number 2, they are made in some measure sensible of the connection there is between their sins and that wrath, or how their sin and guilt exposes them to that wrath, of the dreadfulness of which they have such lively apprehensions, and so fear takes hold of them. They are afraid that will be their portion, and they are sensible that they are in a miserable and doleful condition by reason of sin. Many things in the Scriptures make it evident that this is God's method. The account we have of our first parents confirms it. They had a sense of guilt and danger before Christ was revealed to them. They were guilty, and were afraid of God's wrath, and ran and hid themselves. They were terribly afraid when they heard God coming, and doubtless their sense of their guilt and fear, when they were brought before God and were called to an account, and God asked them what they had done, and whether they had eaten of that tree, whereof he commanded them that they should not eat, prepared them for a discovery of mercy. God made them sensible of their guilt and danger before he revealed to them the covenant of grace. And it is probable that they're reflecting upon what God said about the seed of the woman bruising the serpent's head, soon wrought faith, and that it was not long before that discovery God made of a merciful design towards them was a means of true consolation and hope to them. Joseph's brethren were brought into great distress for fear of their lives before Joseph revealed himself to them. Those who were converted by Peter's sermon were first pricked in their hearts in a sense of their guilt and their danger. Acts 2 verse 37. And Paul, before he had his first comfort, trembled and was astonished. Acts 9 verse 6. And continued 3 days and 3 nights, and neither ate nor drank, which expressed his great distress. The jailer, before he was converted, was in terror. He called for a light and sprang in, and came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas. Acts 16 verses 29 and 30. Christ's invitation is made more especially to the weary and heavy laden, which doubtless has respect, at least partly, to laboring and being weary with a sense of guilt and danger. We read when David was in the cave, then everyone who was in distress was gathered unto him. 1 Samuel 22 verse 1. This doubtless was written as typifying Jesus Christ and the referring of those who were in fear and distress to him. The expression of flying for refuge, by which coming to Christ is signified, implies that before they come they are in fear of some evil. They apprehend themselves in danger, and as fear gives wings to their feet. Proverbs 18 verse 10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The voice of God to a sinner, when he gives him true comfort, is a still small voice. But this voice is preceded by a strong wind and a terrible earthquake and fire, as it was in the case of Horeb when Elijah was there, 1 Kings 19, verse 11 and 12. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. but the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice. Another thing in the Scriptures which seems to evince this is the frequent comparisons between the church spiritually bringing forth Christ and a woman in travail and pain to be delivered. John 16 verse 21 and Revelation 12 verse 2. The conversion of a sinner is represented by the same thing. It is bringing forth Christ in the heart. Paul speaks of men's regeneration as of Christ being brought forth in them, Galatians 4 verse 19. And therefore Christ calls believers his mother, Matthew 12:49 and 50. And he stretched forth his hand toward his disciples and said, Behold my mother and my brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same as my brother and sister and mother. Doctrine: that it is God's manner to make men sensible of their misery and unworthiness before he appears in his mercy and love to them. Thirdly, they are made sensible of the desert of their sin, that their sin deserves that wrath of God to which it exposes them, that they are not only sensible of the dreadfulness of God's wrath. How fearful a thing it would be to fall into the hands of the living God, and to sustain the eternal expressions of his fierce anger, as well as the connection between their sins and this wrath, and how their sins expose them to it. But God is also likely, before he converts them, to show them that their sins deserve this wrath. By a clear discovery of the connection between their sin and God's wrath, they are sensible of their danger of hell, of which many are in a measure sensible, who are wholly insensible of their desert of hell. The threatenings of the law make them afraid indeed that God will punish sins, yet they have no thorough apprehension of their desert of the punishment threatened, and therefore many who are afraid murmur against God. They charge him foolishly with being hard and cruel. But it is God's manner, before he speaks peace to them and reveals his redeeming love and mercy in Jesus Christ, make them sensible that they also deserve it. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him which owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not to pay, the Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him, and forgave him the debt. Very commonly, when men are first made sensible of their danger, their mouths are open against God and his dealings. That is, their hearts are full of murmurings. But it is God's manner, before he comforts and reveals his mercy and love to them, to stop their mouths and make them acknowledge their guilt or their desert of the threatened punishment. Romans 3 verses 19 and 20. Now we know that what things soever the law says, it says to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. God would convince men of their guilt before he reveals a pardon to them. Now, a man cannot be said to be thoroughly sensible of his guilt till he is sensible that he deserves hell. A man must be sensible that he is guilty of death, or guilty of damnation, to use the scriptural mode of expression, before God will reveal to him his freedom from damnation. A sense of guilt consists in two things: in a sense of sin, and in a sense of the relation which sin has to punishment. Now, the relation which sin has to punishment is also twofold. First, the connection which it has with punishment, by which it exposes to it and brings it, and secondly, its desert of punishment, When a man is truly convinced of his desert of the punishment to which sin exposes him, then he may be said to be thoroughly sensible of his guilt. Then he has become guilty in the sense of our text and in the sense of Romans 3, verse 20. Inquiry. How is it that a sinner is made sensible of his desert of God's wrath? A natural man may have a sense of this, though not the same sense which a person may have after conversion, because a natural man cannot have a true sight of sin and of the evil of it. A man cannot truly know the evil of sin against God except it be by a discovery of its glory and excellence, and then he will be sensible how great an evil it is to sin against him. Yet it cannot be denied that natural men are capable of a conviction of their desert of hell, or that their conscience may be convinced of it without a sight of God's glory. The consciences of wicked men are also to be convinced of the justice of their sentence, and of their punishment at the day of judgment, and doubtless will echo to the sentence of the judge and condemn them to the same punishment. Here, therefore, we would inquire how it is that a natural man may be made sensible of this. 1. We shall show what is the principle assisted, and 2, how it is assisted, and 3, what are the chief external means which are used in order to this. First, what principle in man is assisted in convincing him of his desert of eternal punishment? No new principle is infused. Natural men have only natural principles, and therefore all that is done by the Spirit of God before regeneration is by assisting natural principles. To observe, therefore, in answer to this inquiry, that the principle which is assisted in making natural men sensible of their desert of wrath is natural conscience. Though man has lost the principle of love to God and all spiritual principles by the fall, yet natural conscience remains. Now there are two things which are the proper work of natural conscience. One is to give man a sense of right and wrong. A natural man has no sense of the beauty and amiableness of virtue, or of the turpitude and odiousness of vice. But yet every man has that naturally within which testifies to him that some things are right, and others are wrong. Thus, if a man steals or commits murder, there is something within which tells him that he has done wrong. He knows that he has not done right, Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. 2, it may be inquired, how shall God assist natural conscience so as to convince a sinner of his desert of hell? I answer, in general, it is by light. The whole work of God is carried on in the heart of man from his first convictions to his conversion by light. It is by discoveries which are made to his soul. By what light is it that a sinner is made sensible that he deserves God's wrath? It is some discovery that he has which makes him sensible of the heinousness of disobeying and casting contempt upon God, the light which gives evangelical humiliation, and which makes men sensible of the hateful and odious nature of sin, is discovery of God's glory and excellence and grace. But what is it which a natural man sees of God which makes him sensible that sin against God deserves his wrath? For he sees nothing of the excellence and loveliness of God's glory and grace. I answer, particularly it seems to be a discovery of God's awful and terrible greatness. Natural men cannot see anything of God's loveliness, his amiable and glorious grace, or anything which should attract their love. But they may see his terrible greatness to excite their terror. Wicked men in another world, though they do not see his loveliness and grace, yet they see his awful greatness, and that makes them sensible of the heinousness of sin. The damned in hell are sensible of the heinousness of their sin. Their consciences declare it to them, and they are made sensible of it by what they see of the awful greatness of that being against whom they have sinned. 3, the principal outward means which the Spirit of God makes use of in this work of convincing men of their desert of hell, and that is the moral law. The Spirit of God in all of his work upon the souls of men works by his word. And in this whole work of conviction of sin, that part of the word is principally made use of, namely, the law. It is a law which makes men sensible of their sin, and it is a law attended with its awful threatenings and curses, which gives a sense of the awful greatness, the authority, the power, and the jealousy of God. Wicked men are made sensible of the tremendous greatness of God, as it were, in the same manner in which the children of Israel were, namely by the thunders and earthquake and devouring fire and sound of the trumpet and terrible voice at Mount Sinai. All the people who were in the camp trembled, and they said, "Let not God speak with us, lest we die." So it is with the moral law, which God makes use of in assisting the natural conscience to do its work. Galatians 3:24. Therefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. It is the law which God makes use of to make men sensible of their guilt and to stop their mouths. Romans 3:19. Now we know that whatsoever things the law saith, it saith to them that are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God.